What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Week 10 has officially wrapped up, so you know what time it is. I've got my weekly waiver wire pickups for you, looking at the Week 11 top targets, so let's get right into it. Starting off with the quarterback position, we begin with Marcus Mariota, who this last week versus the almighty Patriots, not only was he victorious, but also had a decent fantasy stat line. 228 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and then also 2 rushes for 21 yards. And that makes it now about 2 weeks in a row where Mariota has been a decent fantasy play, especially if you're someone that is streaming at the quarterback position and evaluating your options. And guess what? Week 11, Mariota gets a very nice matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts defense, which we all know is the Achilles heel of that team overall. And as good as Andrew Luck has been lighting up the scoreboard, the reason he's had to do that is because of that subpar Indianapolis defense. Just look what Blake Bortles did to them this last week. Over 300 yards passing and 2 touchdowns. He looked like a viable starting fantasy quarterback again. And honestly, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to see Marcus Mariota come close to duplicating those efforts. I think it'll probably be a little bit less than 300 yards, but again, right around 2 touchdowns. I'd say Marcus Mariota is a safe play for this week as a top 10 fantasy quarterback. Moving on, we have got Dak Prescott, who this last week on the road versus a divisional opponent in the Philadelphia Eagles had 270 yards passing, 1 touchdown through the air, along with 9 rush yards and a rushing touchdown. And look, even though the Dallas Cowboys offense has been up and down, and albeit mostly down this year, they have a good matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons defense this week. And for the Falcons defensively, more often than not, they have allowed opposing quarterbacks to have bounce-back performances and, in general, be fantasy relevant. I mean, look at what happened versus Baker Mayfield, who this last week, not only was he victorious, but probably had one of his best performances of his young NFL career, not only numbers-wise, but also fantasy-wise. And I do think Dak Prescott can duplicate those kind of results. I look at him to be, this week, another good fantasy play at the quarterback position. Next, we have got Josh Rosen, who admittedly so this last week struggled versus the Chiefs. 208 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, and a loss. But guess what? He has the perfect bounce-back opponent this week in the Oakland Raiders defense. This is a defense that pretty much since the start of the year has been giving up points left and right and has somehow managed to get worse. Now, for Josh Rosen, even though he hasn't been that great this year, he's been a rookie, he's made his own mistakes. This could be the best game of his career so far in a home game with the home crowd behind him. And honestly, with the Oakland Raiders defense, this will be a matchup I'll pretty much be highlighting week in and week out as far as opposing quarterbacks are concerned. And this week is no different. I like what Josh Rosen can potentially do. This matchup is just too good to pass up. And even though Rosen has had his fair share of struggles, I think he can have a good performance versus the Raiders. The final spot on this quarterback list is a little bit unique because I want to highlight 2 guys, Lamar Jackson and Joe Flacco, more so focusing on Lamar Jackson. And look, a lot of people at the start of the season were wondering, will Joe Flacco make it a full year? Will he get benched? Well, we might not necessarily see him get benched. More so, we might see him get sidelined because we did see some reports from the bye week here that Flacco dealing with an injury, he is not a sure thing for that Cincinnati game, if not longer. So this could potentially open up the door for Lamar Jackson, and a lot of people have high hopes for Jackson. The reason being is he can be a dual threat quarterback, and he should be able to do enough through the air to be viable there as well. But it is the rushing abilities that has got people really excited, maybe reminding some people of a young Cam Newton. And looking at the fantasy schedule moving forward, this is where it gets incredible, folks, because the Baltimore Ravens have the Cincinnati Bengals, the Oakland Raiders, the Atlanta Falcons, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Tampa Bay Bucks, and the LA Chargers. That takes us all the way to week 16, heading to the playoffs. And honestly, if this was pretty much any other fantasy quarterback, they would be by far the number 1 quarterback to have heading into the fantasy playoffs and finishing off the regular season of fantasy. And now look, I'm not sure what's going to end up happening with Flacco or with Lamar Jackson. If Flacco ends up staying healthy, I still think he could be a viable option in some of those performances. Now, obviously, I don't think he has as high of a ceiling as Lamar Jackson because of the rushing ability, but this is a situation that you want to keep a close eye on. If you have been streaming quarterbacks and if you've been doing it so by matchups, man, it doesn't get much better than the Baltimore quarterback situation going forward. Moving on to our running backs, we start with another pair of teammates in Rashaad Penny and Mike Davis, who, in the absence of Chris Carson, both had nice performances. Rashaad Penny, 12 carries, 108 yards, and a touchdown, while Mike Davis, 11 carries, 58 yards, and then 4 receptions for 22 yards and a touchdown there. So the question is, will Chris Carson be available again? And look, we've seen it with Carson for the majority of the season. He has had some good performances, then gets nicked up, misses a game, and then some guys behind him step up. And unfortunately so, that's been the MO of the Seattle backfield since last year. Just as soon as we get comfortable with one guy, he for some reason doesn't have as big of a day. Someone behind him has a great day, or one of those guys gets injured, opens the door for someone else. And I mean, this is the case with Rashaad Penny. We had given up on this guy, but then Chris Carson gets injured. Penny gets some opportunities. He makes the most out of it. Coaches say, man, this is what we've been looking for. And just like that, Rashaad Penny is a fantasy option to consider. Chris Carson, now on a short week versus the Green Bay Packers, having to play on Thursday night, will he be available? Or could he go ahead and be rested just in case as a precaution to go ahead and have him moving forward? Either way, this isn't a situation to go ahead and monitor, because if Carson is unavailable, I do think Penny and both Mike Davis are viable options versus a Green Bay defense that can be exploited. I like Rashaad Penny more so as your standard format back, especially what he did as far as outgaining Mike Davis on the ground this last week. But I do like Davis as a PPR option because he was a lot more involved in the passing game, also had a pass catching touchdown, but also saw his opportunities as a rusher. So again, this is predicated on Chris Carson's health, but if he is unavailable, which I wouldn't be surprised by, I am taking a hard look at Rashaad Penny and Mike Davis. Next, we have got Derrick Henry, who admittedly so, as far as healthy running backs go that have been available on a week-to-week basis, Henry has been one of the most disappointing guys considering where you drafted him in hopes of what he would be, most likely a running back number 2. But guess what? Since Dion Lewis got to Tennessee, he has been the better running back, the better fantasy option, and just all around the guy that I would prefer. But still, it's hard to ignore what Derrick Henry has done these last 2 weeks, because both weeks he has found pay dirt, gotten a touchdown. This last week versus the Patriots, 11 carries, 58 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, obviously, Henry is a standard running back. In PPR, it's a lot harder to trust him, but he still gets a very friendly matchup versus that Indianapolis Colts defense, a defense that can be exposed. We saw what Leonard Fournette did to them. Fournette, similar as far as running style to Derrick Henry. I think Henry is obviously a touchdown or bust kind of running back. But versus that Indianapolis Colts defense, I'm willing to go ahead and take a chance on Henry. Moving on, we have got Theo Riddick, who, as soon as the Golden Tate trade went down, we highlighted as a potential replacement for him as a pass catcher, someone that could see a lot of targets. Forget about his rushing abilities. He hasn't really done much there. But if you're in a PPR format and you can go ahead and insert a pass catcher in your running back spot, which is pretty much what Theo Riddick is, that could be extremely valuable. 6 receptions for 60 yards this last week versus the Bears. And consider the fact that Marvin Jones also got hurt in that game. That is going to open up even more targets for Theo Riddick. If Riddick is available in PPR formats, I'm taking a long, hard look at him, and he is the guy that I would most likely prioritize as my top running back pickup this week. The last running back I want to highlight here is Jaylen Samuels of the Steelers, who right now isn't even close to being a starting running back, but he does have value, and it's twofold. First and foremost, versatility, because he does have the running back and tight end designation, so you could theoretically plug him in as a tight end, and we all know how big of a mess the tight end position has been this year. But what makes him extremely valuable is him being a handcuff to James Conner, because at this point, we're assuming Le'Veon Bell isn't returning and signing any kind of offers. That's what all reports are. So that means if anything does happen to James Conner, you better have his handcuff as a Connor owner, because you sure as hell aren't going to find another top 5 running back off of waivers if he gets injured late in the season. And we did have a little bit of a scare versus the Carolina Panthers with that concussion, but all reports are Connor will be available to go versus the Jaguars. But again, Samuels and Ridley, most likely it'll be a committee if something does happen to Connor. Personally, however, I do prefer Samuels because primarily of that versatility. Moving on to our wide receivers, we start with Anthony Miller of the Bears, who this last week versus the Lions had 5 receptions for 122 yards and a touchdown. Great performance. And honestly, it starts with this quarterback in Mitch Trubisky, who has been one of the premier fantasy quarterbacks these last couple of weeks. But look, I do want to highlight the fact that some of these opponents that the Bears have played aren't exactly top-notch defenses or teams overall. But now, this week, it gets a little bit serious because they face the Minnesota Vikings, probably the best defense that the Bears have faced all year, and that could present some troubles for Mitchell Trubisky. Now, the silver lining to me here is, even though Trubisky could struggle with some interceptions or lack of touchdowns, I do think the yardage will be there, which obviously benefits Anthony Miller and guys like Allen Robinson. The reason I think that is because the Minnesota Vikings offensively, they are one of the top units in the league, so the Bears are going to have to air it out to keep up with them. And in order to do that, Anthony Miller should continue to stay involved in this passing attack. To me, he is, or should be at least, wide receiver number 2 for the Bears. It's not a coincidence that they moved up in the draft to get him. They value him, and I do think he will continue to get more involved in this season as the weeks progress. Next, we have got Chris Godwin of the Bucs, who this last week versus the Redskins, 7 receptions for 103 yards. And now, week 11, he faces the New York Giants. And I do think the New York Giants defensively are a step down from the Redskins. And we've seen it all year with Ryan Fitzpatrick. This guy can air it out. Even though the Bucs only scored 3 points in that game versus the Redskins, they had so many yards on offense. They just kept turning the ball over, missing field goals, name it, and it happened for them, unfortunately. But it doesn't take away from the fact that Ryan Fitzpatrick airs it out with the best of them. And versus that New York Giants defense, I think he can continue to do the same. I like Chris Godwin this week as a flex play at a wide receiver. Continuing on, we have got Christian Kirk, who this last week was atrocious. 2 receptions for 8 yards. That's pretty much nothing. But look again, this is the Oakland Raiders effect all over. We saw it with Josh Rosen. We're going to see it with Christian Kirk. We're going to see it with some other teammates of theirs. Spoilers for ahead, but look, this is going to be a theme week in and week out, and I do think Kirk can see some success. Personally, I think the rushing attack is going to have a great day. I think Rosen is going to have a pretty good day, and I think the pass catchers are going to benefit from all of that too. Kirk is pretty much the wide receiver number 2 after Larry Fitzgerald in that offense. And I would say that if you need a guy as a flex that can put up around 10 points at the wide receiver position, Kirk is a safe bet this week versus that Raiders defense. The last wide receiver on this list is Josh Reynolds, and his appearance here is a direct result of the Cooper Kupp injury. Unfortunately so, Kupp ACL done for the year, and that means someone's going to have to take his spot. Personally, I do think Josh Reynolds might be one of the favorites. We've seen him have some success in situations where the Rams wide receivers have been injured. But the big thing here to me more than anything is you want to invest in one of these Rams wide receivers outside of Woods and Cooks because of how good that Rams offense is. Personally, I do think Reynolds will get the first opportunity to make an impact. We'll see what happens afterwards. But if I had to go ahead and make a prediction, the people that this impacts the most and benefits the most are actually Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks. They're already 2 bona fide starters and guys that have been producing, already 2 of the favorite targets for Jared Goff. I think they're going to see the majority of the missing targets that Kupp would have gotten. We will see, however, what happens with Josh Reynolds. I would, however, go ahead and invest a pick in him. I wouldn't necessarily prioritize it, but still he is on that explosive Rams offense, so he is worth a look. Getting to our tight ends, it's a short list this week, but regardless, we start with Jeff Heuerman of the Denver Broncos, who last time we saw him play had 10 receptions for 83 yards and a touchdown versus the Houston Texans. Coming off the bye week now, the Broncos face the LA Chargers, and a lot of people were wondering who would be the main beneficiary of Demaryius Thomas leaving. And at least for 1 week, Heuerman was the main guy. I do think Courtland Sutton will still continue to be a big part of that offense. But again, with the tight end position being just so in trouble this year, you're going to take anything you can get, and Heuerman could potentially be a guy that is very valuable moving forward. This week versus that LA Chargers offense, they can again score at will. I do think that all of those pass catchers on Denver will have their opportunities. I'd go ahead and take a speculative look at Heuerman. The second and final tight end on this list is Ricky Seals-Jones of the Cardinals, who this last week versus the Kansas City Chiefs saw 9 targets for 5 receptions and 51 yards. But even though Seals-Jones might not be a week-to-week play, the fact of the matter is the tight end position is one that we all need help in. And when you have this good of a matchup, it's hard to ignore what Seals-Jones might be. It's hard to ignore what any of those Arizona pass catchers might be. That's why we saw guys like Christian Kirk. That's why we highlighted Josh Rosen. And that's why we're seeing Seals-Jones now. I'd like him to go ahead and see his fair share of targets versus that defense. I like him to play a role in the red zone. I'd go ahead and take a chance on Seals-Jones this week. And finally, getting to our defenses, we start with the Washington Redskins, who have a home game versus the Houston Texans. Now, with the Texans, they have been on a bit of a roll. They're at the top of their division. They've got a couple straight wins under their belts, and I do think most likely they continue this train going. They get the victory here, but I anticipate this being a low-scoring affair. At least that's what my initial thoughts are here, and maybe not so much for this week do I like the Redskins defense. However, I do think we'll still see between 7 and 10 points from them. What I'm really excited about Washington is some of their future matchups. If you need a playoff defense, they're facing teams like the Cowboys, the Eagles, the Giants, and the Jaguars, just to name a few. So keep an eye out for the Redskins not only this week, but moving forward. Next, we've got the Arizona Cardinals defense, and you can sure bet that after including all those Arizona skill position players, we would include the defense as well because, again, anytime you face the Oakland Raiders, you got to go ahead and see those mismatches because with the Raiders, well, let's be honest, they've pretty much called it a season at this point in time, so that's going to give some mismatches and some advantages for opposing teams. I like what the Cardinals defense can potentially do versus this Oakland Raiders team as a whole at home. I think they can go ahead and get you a turnover or so. Not a bad sneaky play at the defensive position this week. And finally, we have got the LA Chargers here who face the Denver Broncos in LA, home game, divisional game. And look, we've seen Case Keenum get in trouble a lot more so this season than last. And I do think it could continue here. The Chargers right now are playing great, and I think we will see that defense capitalize on some mistakes by Case Keenum. I still do think there are yards to be had, but the Chargers will make just enough plays to be relevant defensively this week. So with that, we finish up our waiver wire look for week 11. And as always, let me know if you guys agreed or disagreed with my inclusions for these top players. Are there guys that you would have rather seen or guys that you have questions about? Pretty much any questions for Stardom Situm, let me hear it and I'll do my best to help you guys. And as usual, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos.